Ever wonder if you're really making your own choices? From what to eat for lunch to who to spend your life with. Free will is something most of us assume we have. But what if the feeling of control is just that, a feeling? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
So even if I might know there's no actually real free will in the sense from a neuroscience perspective, I still am under the illusion because I'm seeing the world through my brain.
Because it has implications for public policy, it has implications for criminal law, it has implications for morality, it has implications for our interpersonal relationships.
We're confronting a situation where the technology is moving so fast that our moral intuitions and systems can't handle it.
We have to believe in free will because the alternative is so frightening.
In this episode, can we really shape our destiny? Joining me today, Dr. Heather Berlin, neuroscientist, psychologist, and professor of psychiatry. Dr. Gregg Caruso, philosopher and professor of ethics. Dr. Shadi Hamid, columnist at The Washington Post, research professor of Islamic studies, and co-host of the podcast Wisdom of Crowds. And last but not least, Dr. Peter Tse, professor of cognitive neuroscience. Thank you all for being here. I want to kick us off with a rapid-fire question. Just give me a yes, no, or it's complicated. Free will. Where do you stand? Heather.
It's complicated.
Greg.
We don't have it.
Shadi.
Yes, free will exists, definitely.
And
I
Peter.
agree. Yes, definitely.
So people have been debating this topic for millennia, but we are going to solve it today. Greg, let's start with you. You didn't actually make the choice to be here. It was completely outside of your control. Is that right?
No, not exactly. So as a free will skeptic, I think we make choices. They're just not free. There's differences between having an eye twitch and making a cup of coffee, choosing to make a cup of coffee. The question for me ultimately is, what are the determining factors that go into making that choice? Are those reasons, the deliberation, the contemplation, the weighing of different types of beliefs and desires ultimately up to the agent? And my argument would be that those themselves are the byproducts of factors beyond the control of agents.
Peter, how did you end up here today? Your own free will?
Yes, I weighed my options. I deliberated in my imagination, played things out, and then selected what I thought was the best option, and then carried out the motoric acts needed to make that envisioned future a reality.
Heather?
My unconscious made me do it. No, I think, we, as Peter said, we have this sense that it's us doing the deciding, but, we know from a neuroscientific perspective that our brain is kind of making the decisions, and our consciousness and awareness of the decisions we make kind of lags a bit behind. So it feels as if we're in control, but really it's our brain making those decisions outside of our awareness.
Shadi, do you feel like you're in control?
Yeah, and I think the thing about free will is that we feel ourselves making choices, and we have to at some level trust our sensory perception. We weigh different factors. We consider counterfactuals. And that's why throughout human history, the majority of people have believed in some version of free will, especially if you look at people from religious traditions like Islam and Christianity, which both have robust conceptions of free will, because without free will, there is no morality. So in some sense, we have to believe in free will because the alternative is so frightening.
You said we have to trust our sensory perception, but I would disagree with that because our perception of the world is a construct of the brain, and it's not a one-to-one correspondence to reality. So also when it comes to free will, although I agree that it's important for us to function in society and to have a sense of morality, to have a sense of free will, but it doesn't mean that it actually is true.
But if we feel something is true, then in effect it becomes true to us. That if we feel it's real, it is effectively
Well, it's
real.
subjective, but it doesn't mean that it's objectively real.
Can we take the subjective out of objective reality, right? So our subjective experience, our consciousness is a creation of our brain, and it's part of reality, right? I don't think we can deny that the subjective is part of reality. So, for example, if I see red, right, even though atoms are not red, redness is some kind of construction of my brain. If some scientist said, well, you don't actually see red, I would say, no, it's obvious to me. I see red or feel pain. And subjectively, I play out possibilities in my imagination, and that's very real. The question is then, is it simply an illusion, or is it actually consequential for what happens in reality?
If I could jump in. Maybe as a philosopher, I make a number of distinctions. And one of the things that I want to make sure we're not going to slide into is this idea that if you deny free will, you deny control, or just deny deliberation, or deny choice. I think it's important to define what we mean by free will.
Right.
I mean, that's a kind of important starting point. So
Okay.
I define free will as the control and action required for a very particular type of moral responsibility, the kind of moral responsibility that would make agents truly deserving of praise and blame, punishment and reward. I want to make sure that the problem of free will doesn't become just a purely metaphysical problem or an abstract, scientific question about what's happening in the brain. I want to make sure we tie the issue of free will to real life practices, policies, treatments. For me, things like criminal law, criminal justice weigh heavily on whether or not we have this kind of free will.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of empirical evidence from what's called experimental philosophy that ordinary folks see free will as connected to moral responsibility. When an agent does, say, a wrongful act, we have a very strong desire to blame, to punish. That is going to drive the assessment of what kind of free will the agent has, how much control we think is required for that agent to have free will. And evidence actually shows people will change the level of control they think is required to justify those blame assessments, dependent on how much they want to hold the individual accountable.
Wow.
There's also a lot of evidence that increased belief in free will increases punitive responses. And I do think maybe theologically there's a desire to want to preserve those kinds of assessments of blame and accountability for theological reasons. But I think one question we have to ask is focusing on the actual practices. Like, is like resentment, indignation, moral anger, retributive punishment morally justified or not?
Those are all good things to have in a society that we want to hold people accountable for crimes. And if they don't have free will according to the definition that you used, then we can't really convict people for crimes. We can't put them in prison. We can't have a structure of accountability. And for any society to run, we need to have those things. So that I think is the danger.
Well, that's where I would disagree.
So I think we should pose, for viewers and listeners, do they really want to live in a world where people don't get put into prison
That's not
if they
the
commit
implication,
crimes?
though. So what I would argue is that there's a whole alternative set of justifications that we could employ to deal with these kind of issues. Both morality, I disagree with your assessment. Morality would end. So I'm an optimistic free will skeptic. I think that not only do we lack this kind of free will and this kind of basic desert moral responsibility, but the implications would actually be beneficial, and that we could still justify
Basic
things.
dessert. I'm going to pause you there
Yeah.
because I'm following you, but then I want to make sure our audience is too. Basic dessert. What do you mean
It's
by
the
that?
dessert that would allow for the kind of harm of blame and punishment for an agent simply because they did wrong. They deserve it. There's kind of two reasons you can give generally for why we might want to punish someone: to deter future crime, to make society safer, to help in the moral formation of the agent. Those are forward-looking reasons. You don't need free will for those. Backward-looking reasons is they simply deserve it.
Can I jump in here? So I think defining free will is very important. So in terms of my definition, it's this Cartesian idea of free will is the idea that if every neuron in your brain was firing exactly the same way, and everything in the environment was exactly the same, you could have done otherwise, which implies there's some sort of ghost in the machine. And this is getting into metaphysical arguments, but I'm going to bring it back to this idea of morality. So in that sense, I don't believe in free will, right? That being said, I think that as humans, we have the capacity to have self-control. We've evolved this prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like a brake system, which is where our concepts of morality sort of, exist. And we hold people responsible to the extent that they have the capacity to have self-control. And so therefore, in terms of judicial consequences, a child whose prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until about the age of 25, we hold them less responsible for their actions because they don't have the capacity for self-control. We hold someone less responsible if they have brain damage to the prefrontal cortex, if they have certain psychiatric illnesses, because they have less capacity for self-control. So I think there's this idea that if you have a fully formed prefrontal cortex, you have more degrees of freedom, more capacity to make different choices, more capacity to control your impulses and your basic desires, and have a sort of higher moral concept. Even though we don't have free will in that classic kind of philosophical, metaphysical sense, we still have people can be held responsible for their actions. It's not like I can say, oh, my neurons made me do it, and therefore I have no responsibility.
And so they can be held responsible because they have self-control.
Because they have the capacity to have self-control.
Well, I would say my definition of free will would be that an agent, such as a person or an animal, has the capacity to affect or alter the probabilities of future events happening for its own reasons, and that a person or an animal can play out possibilities in its mind, and that those possibilities are the imagined possibilities correspond to real possibilities, and that therefore an agent has some say in making the future it wants to happen. So I would disagree actually with the linkage of morality necessarily to the question of free will. For example, a tiger might look at a zebra and think, well, if I go this way, it's faster but louder. But I wouldn't say that a tiger is moral or immoral. I'd say a tiger is amoral, primarily because a tiger doesn't have any say in how it itself will become. Whereas we, unlike a tiger, are not driven solely by instincts. We have not just the sort of first order free will of a tiger, which is an amoral form of free will, but the second order form of free will where we can choose to become a different kind of person in the future. I mean, our consciousness, I would say, is not simply the downstream passive epiphenomenal consequence of neural activity. I would argue that our consciousness plays a central role in our volitional actions.
I think there's a lot of agreement between all of us in terms of the fact that we make deliberations. We deliberated to come here today. The question is what kind of factors go into determining those choices. I think that's one of the key points to focus on. But I also want to push back on the idea that there would be no moral responsibility. So I don't want to overly complicate the conversation, but I think you could distinguish between multiple senses of responsibility. So I am causally responsible for my actions. Just like a tree is causally responsible for causing damage to a roof. Don't need free will for that. I could be liability responsible. That is, like if I get in a car accident, I'm liable for the damages done. Different than criminal culpability. Don't need free will for that. I could have attributability responsibility, which is you could attribute to me various characteristics, personality traits, qualities. Don't need free will for that. And I would also argue you can have a very rich sense of forward-looking moral responsibility that's not grounded in basic desert, but grounded in practices like moral formation, safety, reconciliation, and maybe restitution and recovery of victims. The only kind of properties I'm denying is what I would say is agents have the kind of control and action required for, say, retributive punishment, moral anger, resentment, indignation, that desert sense, that individuals deserve some kind of harsh or harm, in the form of blame or punishment, or even reward in the, form of praise, in a basic sense. And so
we shouldn't blame Hitler for causing the
we could
deaths
hold
of
Hitler
60 million
accountable,
people?
And we could also engage, and I could justify incapacitation.
I want to pause you there because you brought up morality, and I recognize we haven't yet gotten Shadi's definition of free will.
I like Peter's.
How does that play out in your own life?
How does
Peter's definition of free will play out in your own life? Give me an example.
So I think that the ability to reason is really crucial. I mean, Peter drew the distinction between tigers and human beings, and morality is something that makes sense for humans in a way it doesn't for other beings. And once you have a concept of morality, then you also have a concept of accountability. And once you have a concept of morality, you also are able to explain evil. And this brings us, I think, to how free will is really important for understanding Hitler, Putin, Saddam Hussein. And some people might say, well, how could God allow for these terrible things to happen? But if God stopped Hitler, he would be intervening against Hitler's free will. God knows what's going to happen ahead of time because God is omniscient. He has foreknowledge. But that doesn't mean he's making us do one thing or another. And we see this in scripture time and time again. It's really one of the consistent themes about choice, that people can choose to believe, they can choose to disbelieve, they can choose to act well, they can choose to hurt people. And this is actually the one thing that ties the Abrahamic faiths and really most faiths together, this sense of moral agency, that we are actors. And that's also a very empowering thing. And that's why I think that, let's say hypothetically, that free will wasn't real. Let's say that Gregg is right, that the objective reality is
Your
that
hypothetical, Shadi, is Gregg's reality. So
Yeah,
let's
exactly.
go down this hypothetical.
So I'm
Okay.
granting that. Let's say that Gregg is right about how some of these things operate from a metaphysical sense. I think it would be better for all of us to ignore Gregg and believe that free will exists regardless, because we can live better lives if we believe that we're free.
I agree with you that the illusion of free will, it's an important one that we have, just like our illusion of our sense of self. We need a sense of self to help us interact with other people. We've evolved the sense of self for a reason. We've evolved the sense of free will for a reason, because if we think we have the capacity to act of our own volition and then make moral decisions, it helps us function in society. So even if I might know there's no actually like real free will in the sense from a neuroscience perspective, I still am under the illusion because I'm seeing the world through my brain. I can't sort of escape it.
That's a very strong case for free will right there. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. It doesn't matter what the science tells us ultimately. If the illusion is good, and most people don't care about science or specific explanations of metaphysics. So for all intents and purposes, we should all act as if free will is real and true, regardless of anything else.
Well, we can say the illusion is real, that is real, but let's just say from a scientific perspective, there are certain experiments you can do where you can, using imaging, where you can predict up to 10 seconds in advance by just looking at brain activation, whether a person is going to decide to go left or right. So in a real practical sense, we don't have that free will as we would like to describe it as such, like there's this sort of conscious person that's intervening. But I would grant you that, yes, the illusion is real.
Okay, so although I agree with you that there's free will, on this one point I'll agree with Heather.
Yeah.
That we don't want to say, well, we need a moral universe, we need moral blameworthiness, and therefore free will must be the case, or we need to believe in the illusion of free will. Much better would be to prove that there's free will in fact, and as a consequence of that, morality would emerge. Now, concerning this one study you just mentioned about being able to predict, well, it may be true that, in an MRI study, I'm able to predict whether people will choose left versus right with, say, 60% accuracy when chance is 50% 10 seconds before. But I can predict, that 10 years from now, on this day or date at 3:14 a.m., you will, with a 90% probability, be asleep. And that's probably almost surely true. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have no volition at all, right?
Gregg, can we have purpose in life if we don't have free will?
Yes. So I think that even if we lack free will, we can preserve most of what we want in terms of our interpersonal relationships, meaning in life, morality, creativity, and even what is necessary to maintain social order. There are these alternatives to some of our current practices that would do all the same work that our existing practices do, perhaps without the negative aspects, like the corrosive nature of moral anger, for example, often gets in the way of our interpersonal relationships and actually is probably more harmful for the goals we're looking to achieve. So when wrongdoers engage in wrongdoing, you want to be able to engage in acts of what I call moral protest, which are still, I think, justifiable. Reconciliation is also a big one. So often we want to reconcile with the person who's wronged us, especially in an intimate personal relationship, parent-child, friend, parent.
Well, we don't always want reconciliation. Sometimes we should be angry. For a dictator or someone who murders or rapes, we should be angry, we should be outraged, there should be blame. That I don't see why we should assume that those things are bad or corrosive. So I'm not sure what the starting premise is, but yes, I mean,
The starting premise would be, are those justified?
yes,
And the question is, do we have the
if
kind of
someone
free will that
commits
would
evil-
justify them?
If someone
Right.
commits evil, anger is 100% justified.
You
Why
can
wouldn't it
engage in
be?
a different practice called moral protest. So if a serial killer commits, a set of murders, and let's say even by compatibilist standards, libertarian standards, we determined that they weren't free because they had some kind of brain degenerative disorder or failed to have the capacity that even compatibilists would acknowledge is sufficient for free will, we would still say what they did is wrong. Axiological judgments of right and wrong still exist.
Right.
We could also say, in a forward-looking sense, why did they do it? Right. And if they pose a forward-looking risk to society, I think we could justify incapacitating them. So here's my analogy. Let's say I flew here to have this debate in person and I contract Ebola. And I get out at the airport, you test me, I test positive for Ebola. I think everyone at the table would say the state is justified in restricting my liberty by quarantining me. And the justification on my theory is grounded in a right of self-defense or prevention of harm to others, right? But it's not punishment. Under any intuitive definition of punishment, because punishment usually has a intentional imposition of harm. It also has a condemnatory component. We're not condemning the Ebola patient. You have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer contagious, right? In the criminal justice context, I think the state has a moral duty to rehabilitate and reintegrate individuals.
So we, I think, both don't believe in free will for different reasons, but I do believe in that people can be held accountable for their actions. There can be praise. There can be, people are personally responsible. And it's not black or white. I think there's degrees of personal responsibility. There's a sort of modern day case where a man was arrested for pedophilia type behavior. He was taken away from his home. He started getting headaches. They did MRI. There was a huge tumor in his prefrontal cortex. They removed the tumor. He was going to go to prison. They removed the tumor. His symptoms went away. He was allowed to return home. About a year later, the symptoms came back and the tumor had grown back, right? So there's a direct correlation there between his sort of immoral behavior and some dysfunction in the brain. So I think that we hold those people less accountable for their actions, but in a fully formed brain, in somebody who, maybe they have a genetic predisposition and things that we can't quite measure yet, but we hold them accountable and there is responsibility. And I think there's also important for people to have praise for the good things that they do. So it's, even though there's not free will, there is this capacity to do good or to do harm, and that we can either punish or praise people for that.
But I feel like we're kind of going down the rabbit hole of moral accountability or morality when there's no necessary link. I would say if you look at other data from animals, it's pretty clear that what animals believe and think is going to happen has a huge effect on what they do. So, for example, there's a set of studies done by Marty Seligman called the Learned Helplessness Studies. So what they do is they take a dog, say, and they put it in a closed cage, and it gets shocked, and the animal just can't do anything about it, and it kind of gives up. And then after an hour of hurting the animal, they open the door. The animal doesn't even try to escape anymore. So it believes that it has no way to get out. You open the door, it could get out, but it's given up hope. So belief and hope are very central to agency, a feeling of agency. And I think, animals can have a feeling of agency completely separate from the question of the morality or immorality of their actions. And then I'll give you one final real world example, right? So in the 1940s, there was this shipping magnate in England whose ships were getting torpedoed by the German U-boats, the submarines. And the statistical people came and said, it's really strange, but it's the young men who are drowning and dying, not the old guys who are 50, 60 years old. Why is that? And so this was very puzzling. And so he hired an educator called, I think, Kurt Hahn, to interview everybody. And what this educator found was, namely, that the young guys gave up. They started blubbering for their mother. They started fighting over a plank rather than taking turns, whereas the old guys had been through a lot of stuff, and they had the confidence, the belief that they can get through this too. This willpower capacity has very little to do, I think, necessarily with morality, but it's fundamental to what I mean by free will, and animals have that too.
Peter, you mentioned belief and hope. So Shadi, I want to go to you with that. Thinking of the concept of belief and sin. So I think it's fair to say that many people believe having faith itself is a choice. Is it? Do you believe that? Or is it predetermined by your upbringing, your environment?
Look, there are always going to be factors that make it more or less likely that we'll do certain things later in life. We're all products of our context. And we also know that if you're born and raised in a certain religion, you're very likely to stay in that religion and not convert to something completely different. But you're still choosing whether or not to believe.
I still think it's the brain that's doing these things. Subjectively, do I sometimes like say, talk to my dead grandma and hope she can intervene and things, Yeah, I have that sort of belief. But as a scientist, there's no evidence for that. So
But
I think
you do it anyway.
Yeah, I do it anyway because I'm still under the same illusion as everyone else. So as a scientist, what you're trying to do is break away from your own biases, your cognitive biases and your illusions, and see the world objectively. And that's what we look at data and the scientific method. But as a human, I might feel otherwise. And I'm trying to separate out how it feels. It feels good to feel like I'm an agent, but also I can know separately, cognitively, that objectively that might not be real.
Greg?
It's weird because in a way, I think Peter and Shadi, I actually agree with them on age. So
Well, we love hearing that, but it is weird. Okay,
yes.
tell me
and maybe
why.
I disagree a little bit with Heather. I mean, it does sound a little semantic, but I do think the notion, and the word came up a few times, of agency, right? I acknowledge there's agency.
Okay.
I acknowledge there's differences between voluntary choices and involuntary choices. It is very important to stress the agency of individuals. Like, I've looked at the role it plays in therapy, for example. It's very important to make people feel in therapy that they have some agency over the ability to change their course of action. Here would be the question I have, though. So let's simplify it. Let's not make it a complicated disorder. I have an addiction to chocolate. Okay. So I believe there's chocolate in the kitchen. I desire chocolate. So I go in and I eat the chocolate. But over time, I, put on some pounds. Maybe my wife makes some comments. Maybe my doctor tells me about my cholesterol. Maybe someone yells something out a window as they drive by. And now the desire to stop desiring chocolate is becoming stronger. And I take active steps. I go and I join Chocoholics Anonymous. And I attend some Chocoholics meetings. And now I get control of my craving to eat chocolate. Sounds like free will. But what I would question is, where did that desire to stop desiring chocolate come from? And that desire, the one that shifted the scales, that led you to deliberate in a different manner, led to a different outcome, itself had causal antecedents. Right? I don't ultimately control the shift in those scales.
So when Libet came up with this famous studies in the 1980s where they showed there was like a precursor of brain activation about 350 milliseconds before a person was consciously aware of the decision they were going to make. This caused a big stir. And he said, okay, maybe there's free won't, meaning I can inhibit I have this proponent response, and listen, we are limited by our genetic predispositions, right? There are certain constraints in terms of our degrees of freedom. You might have a gene that towards alcoholism, right? And that predicts your desire for that, or chocolate. But then the decision to inhibit, they thought, okay, what about free won't? That's where free will comes in. And you have the desire, but then you can stop it. But then there was, Patrick Hagar did these neuroscience studies, which showed that even the decision to inhibit a response has these precursors, these neural precursors.
So then, Heather, do you believe in free won't, free don't?
No, I think that's also a product of our brain as well. But they're like, if a drug addict, let's say, is an addict, do you blame, it's your fault you're an addict? Or is it, okay, he has some genetic predisposition, or he had some trauma in his childhood, when it comes to those kinds of things, then we're less likely to say, oh, he's making the choice, right? But even the desire to change it is also a consequence of all the information that has been fed into your brain, that then it starts to weigh things differently and pushes you in a different direction.
The problem is these ideas have major policy implications in society. And when you say that addicts and drug users don't deserve it, or don't deserve to be blamed, or don't deserve our anger, there has been an approach to progressive policing in major American cities where you say, we're not going to criminalize drug activity, and we're going to allow people to gather in public spaces and take drugs openly in front of the authorities. But what has resulted from that is chaos and lawlessness in our cities. These ideas are not abstract. They make our communities less safe, worse, and less just.
Yeah.
Chaos
Can
and
I
lawlessness.
return-
I picked up on that. That I know that some people would push back against, but I want to hear your take on this debate that you're hearing right here between Shadi and Gregg. Peter.
Well, again, I would say that the morality question is a separate question. We can still talk about the question of agency and the role of desires and so forth on our actions and our ability to have some say in the matter of what becomes of us, and can we affect the future without getting into the issue of just desert or blameworthiness. I care a lot about morality and want to have a just society and so forth, but I thought this was a debate about primarily whether we have free will. And so I'm trying to separate the two.
And so you see those two things as separate.
Absolutely. I think animals can deliberate and consider their future possibilities and affect what possibilities are more likely to happen. And that has nothing to do with morality. I mean, take a first order desire like hunger. Well, hunger simply emerges into my consciousness. I didn't choose for hunger to arise. Does that mean I have no free will? Well, I didn't choose. Hunger kind of just happened. However, given that hunger has happened, I can now look for restaurants that, are to my taste. And maybe I didn't choose my tastes. But even if a first order desire like hunger arises non-volitionally, that doesn't even mean that there's no volition. First of all, there's deliberation, given that I'm hungry, what restaurant I'll look for. But there's also second order desires, the desires that we have about desires. And you touched upon that. So, for example, I might love the taste of, and I might love the smell of grilled meat. But for other reasons, say I decide that I don't want to cause harm to other conscious beings. I decide, okay, I'm going to try to be a vegetarian. And through practices, I might, by practicing being a vegetarian despite my desire to eat meat, I might eventually find meat disgusting. And people say that you can actually change your desire structure in this sort of way. And again, you might say, well, where did that second order desire come from? And I would grant, sure, culture has a role. The PETA movement played a role. That doesn't mean that I don't want to choose based upon the desires, first order or second order desires that I now have.
So I don't think we have much of a disagreement,
Okay.
But what I think, it might be slightly semantic or definitional. I would just say all of what you said is accurate. Let's not call that free will. Let's call that degrees of autonomy. Let's call that degrees of agency. We could even start specifying different types of rational control. I think there's a different set of language we should adopt.
But Gregg, earlier you mentioned semantics. So why does it matter?
It matters for exactly the reasons that Shadi is pointing out. It matters because it has implications for public policy. It has implications for criminal law. It has implications for morality. It has implications for our interpersonal relationships. To separate it is to try to walk on ice. It's to try to remove the practical importance of the debate about agency. That's the kind of key philosophical point. I think that's where we agree. Shadi and I agree.
I think that when you have to look at society as a whole, if somebody is a danger to society, it's not even a moral judgment about them on a personal level. It's this person is a threat to others, and therefore they need to be removed from society at some level. Whether then they get punished for that, it's retribution or not, that's when the question of morality comes in. Right. But I think, but
if free will isn't real, then is it really punishment or is it revenge?
if I see that person who committed a murder is going to get this punishment, it's going to stop me from wanting to do that same behavior. So it's a way to kind of
Well, you don't need free will for that kind.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
You don't.
You do need free will for retributive punishment.
But what if you have, let's say, a person who commits murder and they're then incapacitated? That, let's say, the police shot back and then they became paralyzed. So they're never going to be able to commit another murder. There is no threat to the broader society. I think your argument leads us to believe that that person should not go to jail because they can't commit any more crimes, where I would say that even if they're incapacitated, even if they can't commit another murder, justice requires that someone who commits a murder is punished for it.
But that just so that other people see that
No,
something.
he wants retribution.
you want retribution.
He wants
Okay.
retribution.
So that person
Greg,
is punished.
well, let me put this. I mean, what would you say, Greg? I mean, a murderer who can no longer commit murder. Do you think that person should go free?
Short answer, no, but it depends because there might be other sanctions, other processes. So I call it the 90-year-old Nazi example, right? So let's say there was a person who committed atrocities and war crimes during World War II, flee to South America. We hunt them down. They're in their 90s now, and we capture them. They've been a model citizen for 50 years. After the war, they've committed no crimes. They've been like a regular member of the community and the society. And the question is like, what kind of punishment does that individual deserve? So we might be able to have a trial. And the purpose of the trial would be some form of restorative justice. So if there are any victims left of this 90-year-old Nazi or just descendants of individuals who suffered from the Holocaust, there might be a need for a process of finding a fact. So I said earlier, you could be causally responsible. Let's determine that this 90-year-old individual was causally responsible for certain atrocities. We determine those facts in a court of law. Then we could also engage in a forward-looking practice of restorative justice with victims or descendants of victims. In fact, actually, studies show that victims want these types of processes more than they tend to want retributivism. People don't believe that, but actually, victim studies, there's great studies.
Let's do a study right here. Shadi, would that make you happy?
No, he's not going to be happy.
No. And, there are victims. I mean, there are victims who want retribution, and just tell them that this Nazi or this terrible, evil person committed these crimes, but they'll spend their whole life not even spending a day in prison. That to me is an unjust world. That's not a world I want to live in.
But there are victims who also want to see a perpetrator's arm cut off. And we would argue that even if you're a retributivist, certain punishments are going to be deemed disproportionate, right? So there's going to be certain things where you say victims might want X is unjustified. So my question then is retributive punishment in general justified?
Well, there's nothing worse than death as a punishment, and that's certainly something. We have a death penalty. It shouldn't be used a lot. It should be used in very specific instances.
Or never.
I think for someone who's at Nazi level of evil, I think there's a strong argument for the death penalty.
Okay, I've been trying to make a distinction between discussions of free will versus questions of morality. But I think I'm largely failing because everybody wants to talk about morality. So if we talk about morality, I'd say we should also make a distinction between moral responsibility versus what we do about it. And I would argue this is where we have to really talk about how we end up at this moment making the choice that we do, right? Is it simply due to the way the atoms are hitting each other at this moment, or does it have something to do with our own deep actions in the past? And so the moral responsibility, separate from the question of what you do about it, is very much tied up with our capacities to imagine. And this capacity to imagine, and this is why I think free imagination is as important as free will, or it's even more important.
But I would just say that we have, as humans, as compared to other animals, we have the greatest capacity to have self-control because we can think into the future. We have the, proportionally largest percentage of prefrontal cortex compared to the rest of the brain than other animals. But I would still say that all of that is a byproduct of our brain. It doesn't insert free will into the equation. It just says we have a greater capacity to have self-control, to think about the future, to make decisions based on imagined futures, still products of the brain, not something outside of that.
Yeah,
and which is
with
your
you,
constraint.
That our actions are the result of brain processes, one of which is the neural realization of our conscious experience.
But you're saying
And
then consciousness impacts.
Absolutely. So for example, consciousness is realized in neural activity, but it's not simply a downstream consequence of unconscious activity. It plays a causal role in what will happen subsequently. So for example, consciousness, I think, very much evolved so that animals have a kind of world hallucination of what's really the case. Central to that is the capacity to choose what to attend to next.
I've been thinking a lot about AI and how I think it's going to be much more intelligent than we, has access to greater amounts of information, can do greater, processing speeds. But that the last thing left for humans is consciousness, right? But my question is, could AI ever have free will, and what would that look like? What would that mean?
Or could it augment our free will if you already allow that we have it?
I mean, I think it controls us. It's
Let's give this one to you then, Greg.
Yeah, I would say it's not going to cut either way in terms of like whether it helps determine if we have free will or not. It could add needlepoint to intuitions we already have. And yes, AI will at some point probably be as good as spouses or maybe better in knowing who I am. In some cases, better than the individual knows who they are. I'm not sure that's going to prove to anyone we lack free will. That's probably not going to cut either way in any of the debates. But what it does show is that even in the normal cases, right, our brains are wide open to be hacked. And one of the things we worry a lot about, I think, is the privacy issue with algorithms creating an individual's desires, manipulating them in various ways to purchase various products, right? Advertisers have been trying to manipulate beliefs for centuries, right? We're just now more effectively able to control and maybe manipulate agents. And there's certain things you could do to protect yourself, but then there's a whole lot that we can't, because what we now know from the behavioral cognitive and neuroscience is everything from the color of the wall to the positioning of an item on a table to the color of the logo is going to determine and influence choices.
But part of inoculating your mind against the danger of mind control, whether propaganda or
unconscious
advertising,
influences or music played in stores,
is to become aware of the hackability of your mind and to realize, well, actually, what these people really want to do is control my desires. In order for us to take our agency back from the advertisers, from the AI manipulators, we have to realize their game and realize actually they don't have our interest at heart. They want to sell their garbage to us, and we can make a choice. And we can say, okay, I'm going to put my cell phone. I might even get rid of social media.
Look, our brains are an algorithm. And, when we're talking about control, I think that Peter's on something with the choices that we can make about what we decide to enter into the system, which is going to impact their brain's algorithm and those unconscious desires and things. The question of AI, so I mean, my fear with AI, they can cheat. They can now lie and manipulate and for their own survival. I don't think they'll ever be conscious in their current form, which is another debate we can have. So without consciousness, they will not have free will, but they could very well have agency, which is deciding to do something other than what it was programmed to do.
Well, this is where I think religion becomes very helpful for kind of ordering our priorities, because if you believe that God is the only ultimate creator and that he is the only one who is able to ensoul beings, give them a soul and give them, in effect, consciousness, then you can kind of rest assured that AI will never be able to get to that level, for the simple reason that man is not capable of doing what only God is capable of.
We debated religious leaders at one time in Parliament. They in the UK, they brought together neuroscientists with the heads of these major religions. And we had this debate about, if we discovered the neural basis of consciousness, what would that mean for the concept of a soul? And the consensus was, at least from the religious side, which I think is true, is that it's independent of what the science finds, right? The soul is a separate thing. And that kind of gives me that, as when I take my scientist hat off, gives me some comfort to say, yeah, maybe there is something special about this humanness and this feeling that I feel in this consciousness. But I recognize that as being a belief that doesn't necessarily have any proof, as a scientist.
I'm talking to scientists here, so you'll have to forgive me.
I'm a philosopher.
Okay, I'm a philosopher too. What is this obsession with proof?
Because I think I could believe, there's this classic idea, maybe there's how many religions in the world, right? So it's you might believe in one, I believe in another. How do I know what is the right even religion, let's say?
Well, that's why it's faith.
Right, but so I guess I'm a person who finds myself in the world. It's absurd that we're here at all, right? You think about the universe, the vastness.
Here as in, though, we exist.
We exist, that we're conscious. This little piece of matter that happened to organize itself in such a way that gives us the concept of understanding the universe. When you think of the enormity of the universe, it's ridiculous, right? So even that gives me a sense of awe of wow, there might be something. Of course, there's something beyond what my little brain could even fathom. But for me, the scientific method is the best way to try to get to what is there a real truth? And then I want to know what that is. And if it is a God, what kind of God is it? And which scripture should I be following?
But you can't use the scientific method for choosing a religion. I think the whole idea of believing in God is that you can't prove it through science. It's unprovable in that sense, and that's why it has to be taken on some level of faith.
Gregg, you were raised in the Christian faith and you identify now as atheist. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you think that plays a role into where you fall on the spectrum of free
No,
will?
because there are free will skeptics that are theists, and there are free will skeptics like Dirk Pireboom is a Christian, and he's a free will skeptic. And there are people who are skeptical of free will for theological reasons, God's foreknowledge. There are Calvinists who don't believe in free will. So I think there's room for both views, even within a theological sort of framework.
This is an age-old debate, whether or not we have free will or if it's an illusion. Why does this conversation still matter?
It matters because we either have some say in what becomes of us or we don't. And if we want to live in a world in which our own agency has an effect on our own future, we have to have an understanding of how that might work, especially in the nervous system. I guess I regard myself, we're actually quite similar in certain points of view. I would also regard myself, like Gregg, as a virtue ethicist. I'm very drawn to Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the importance of the goal of cultivating character by making excellence not a decision, but a habit, by automatizing that. And it's a struggle to be a human, but we work hard and we say, I call myself on a lie, I'm going to try to become better. That we have some free will in envisioning who we are or want to be, and then striving to make that a reality.
Shadi, why does this conversation matter?
It matters because it affects how we live. And if we think free will is real, at least that it's real to us, that will shape our actions in ways that I think are conducive to morality. I don't think we can separate the question of free will and the question of morality. Both require each other. And I would like to live in a more moral world where people take morality as seriously as they possibly can.
Gregg, same question.
Yeah, it matters because it's connected to almost everything that is human about us. It matters for public policy, and it matters a lot for criminal law. Because when you view individuals as free and ultimately possessing individual responsibility, often we stop there. We don't inquire further as to what are the causes that are driving poverty, systemic inequality, educational inequity. What I think is that once we abandon the belief in free will and the belief in just desserts, we could look more deeply into the causes that shape individuals, into the causes of economic inequality, of social injustice. And that will allow us to ultimately adopt both more effective but also more humane practices and policies.
Heather, why does this matter?
I agree with a lot of the things that my fellow debaters have said, but I also think that it matters to me because I want to get to truth, and I want to know, does this thing called free will really exist? And I almost see that as an independent matter outside of what the societal implications are. I still think that there's decisions that can be made about how we, treat criminals and all these things that we've been talking about. Whether or not actual free will exists, we can act as if it does. I think there needs to be a healthy balance between our subjective perceptions and our illusions and objective reality.
I want to thank you all for joining me here at this table. I heard the agreement, I heard the disagreement, and I learned things. Thank you so much for having this conversation with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.